Channing.
Welcome to the 3 Degrees podcast on a very historic night, but it's not a night of celebration. It's the night when Cat 5 Melissa came ashore in Jamaica, and we're going to be talking exclusively about what is going to be the news tomorrow, and to quote the movie, the day after tomorrow. Chris?
This truly was a historic storm, and I want to just share some of this video. First, you'll hear the natural sound from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft penetrating the eye, coming out of the eye wall. But just look at this this video from the Hurricane Hunters earlier. We'll open my mic. That is as plastic as technical as you possibly get when it comes to the structure of the hurricane, what we call a stadium effect. It doesn't go straight up and the stadium goes straight inside the middle of the eye. Really a remarkable storm. And it was dangerous for those hurricane hunters that made their way through. I was watching one of those reconnaissance flights that was in the middle of the eye that got truly the historic data from the storm, but they were trying to find their escape route out of the eye. Early reports indicate that they may have lost about 1,000 feet of altitude. The Air Force Hurricane Hunter aircraft that encountered it, there were reports of some injuries, but this was the statement released from the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. Again, not the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, but this was the Air Force Hurricane Hunters. Again, this was their statement following that event. I'm so excited about tonight's guest. I was on a science advisory board with Alan Gerard for the last couple of days, and it's a whole bunch of meteorologists. And when you have this, essentially the Super Bowl of meteorology going on, it's hard to concentrate, but he's really amped and has so much great information. I had to invite him on tonight, and I'm going to invite him in, and I'm going to throw it to David for the first question. But Alan, thanks for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us on short notice. We all have so many questions, and I know the public has so many questions for you also, but I'm wondering if you could just take us through a little bit of the setup from tropical storm to not only one, but two rapid intensification events that led to the high winds and the super low pressure system. So have at it.
Sure. So, Melissa essentially formed out of a tropical wave, which is essentially a wave of low pressure that moves west across the Atlantic from off the coast of Africa all the way across to the Caribbean Sea. And once it got just south of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, of the island of Hispaniola, it started to become better organized. What was really interesting about Melissa from early on was that, we have these computer models that we utilize to forecast these weather events. And there was kind of two camps of models. One camp that really developed Melissa very rapidly and took it north across Haiti and the Dominican Republic and out to sea, where there was another camp of models which developed Melissa much more slowly. It really struggled early on, but because of that, it didn't get caught up in kind of the jet stream flow, and it moved more slowly to the west, which actually enabled it to encounter this really favorable setup for development to the south of Jamaica, where the waters were incredibly warm. The wind shear, the change in wind in altitude within the atmosphere was very light, which is very favorable for tropical storms to develop. And that pretty much set it up for Once it kind of got going, it initially develops into a stronger tropical storm, and what we call the core of the circulation starts to organize. Once that happened with Melissa, it was just kind of off to the races. Everything else was really favorable, and unfortunately, it did what it did.
Alan, let me ask you, just from the standpoint of the lawyer chair, where I've been watching the hurricane seasons for, maybe the last 15 years with greater and greater alarm. It sure seems like these storms are, coming, from the east, coming out of Africa, working their way towards the Caribbean and in many cases into the Gulf. But we've seen a season here where so many of these storms have been, I guess I'll call it, deflected or directed north, and then in almost all cases back into the Atlantic. And I know even the early paths for Melissa suggested it was going to go into Mexico. Now, again, this might just be the uninformed Channing, looking at the graphics, but what is going on in this particular season that is turning these storms in this pattern that we've seen several times here in the last 8 weeks?
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple of things going on here, and I will also ask Chris to jump in if he would like with his perspective on this. But there are a couple things happening here that at least have some potential ties to what some of the climate models suggest as far as happening with climate change. One of those is the potential for us to have this wavier jet stream. The jet stream is the band of winds, high up in the atmosphere that kind of guides weather systems and determines the overall weather pattern around the globe. And there's some indication that as the tropics are getting warmer, but the poles are warming even more rapidly, that's causing the jet stream to kind of slow down and become wavier, and it gets locked into these patterns for longer periods of time than what we used to see. And this year, this summer, late summer and early fall, we've been locked into this pattern where there's been this trough in the jet stream, this dip in the jet stream over the eastern United States. And that's pretty much meant that all of these systems that have come off of Africa and developed in the central and eastern Caribbean or Atlantic have just been deflected away from the U.S. coast by this dip in the jet stream. And because it's been so persistent, and it was there pretty much through the peak of the hurricane season, it pretty much kept all these hurricanes turning more to the north. With Melissa, it basically got into this weak steering flow for a few days, which caused it to meander around Jamaica. But even eventually, the trough kind of got reorganized and reloaded over the east, and that's what's picking it up now.
So great. Let me jump in here, Chris. I just want to follow up real quickly. So you're saying this is the Donald Trump effect. He's just been diverting those. I'm joking. He's been diverting those storms away from the Caribbean because he's so all powerful. But of course, I am joking.
I do want to show, though, you made a great point, though, when you said, that wavier pattern, and essentially it still followed that pattern that we've seen all season long, because if you look at Jamaica, the storms that have come within 50 miles of that island nation come from the east, go to the west. Not only was this the strongest storm to make landfall in Jamaica, it is the first one to come from the south as it has started to recurve back out into the Atlantic. So that's a great observation. That's kind of the graphic to support that this truly was an anomaly, but kind of similar to what we've been seeing throughout the season. I do want to show another thing, Alan, and unfortunately I didn't see it today in person. When this drops on, the look inside that eye, I think we're all worried that this wasn't going to happen. It seemed like the Hurricane Hunter aircraft was inside the eye for such a long time. You're talking a sub 900 millibar center of low pressure. what are the odds, and since we are prognosticators, I will put you on the spot a little bit, that they look at some of this data after the fact, and this becomes a 200 mile per hour hurricane with this lowest central pressure after the fact? Do you think the evidence is there to support that? And what have you looked at between that reconnaissance flight and landfall?
Yeah, my guess, and again, like you said, I'm prognosticating here, and I'm prognosticating the hindcast, which is probably even more dangerous. And with limited, to be fair, with limited data, because as you know, as you mentioned, Chris, you and I have been in a meetings the last couple of days.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised. The Hurricane Center is usually pretty conservative when they do these reanalyses. I mean, and just to be clear, they do a reanalysis of every tropical cyclone. That's just standard operating procedure for the Hurricane Center. They reanalyze all of the data from every tropical cyclone and prepare a detailed final report, which kind of goes in the records as the official record for that particular storm. After the data that you just showed, there was one more pass through the center that actually showed just slightly higher pressures, like 895 millibars, which is still insane, but it would seem to indicate that, it likely wasn't getting any stronger. I would say that it's not impossible that the winds could be bumped up a little bit, depending on, what they're going to take a close look at some of the data that was gathered by dropsondes, essentially instruments that are dropped out of the aircraft. And that might result in a little bit of a tweaking of the winds.
I'm not sure we've heard yet about rain totals, but there was a lot of discussion about 20 to 40 inches of rain across the island in some places. Now, I know the western half of the island took the brunt of the storm, but the eastern side also probably had a lot of rain, and there's a lot of mountains in that area too, with a 9 to 13 foot storm surge. And as a sailor, I also took a look at when high tide was, and it was at 1 p.m. So they did have a high tide about the time it came on shore. So I was just wondering about the mix of those conditions and what you think was going on the ground there when all that was happening.
Yeah, so I'll start with the rainfall. My unfortunately, on a lot of these Caribbean islands, we don't have the kind of observational data that we're kind of spoiled to have here in the United States. So we don't have any, easy access to radar rainfall estimates or observed rainfall totals. But just from looking at there is a radar in Kingston, weather radar in Kingston, and there's a couple weather radars on the south coast of Cuba that can see over Jamaica. Just looking at those, I mean, my guess is that there were massive rainfall totals, especially in the central and western mountains of Jamaica. That's where it looked like the most persistent rainfall occurred. But certainly, I'm sure the eastern, it's a matter of magnitude. I'm sure the eastern part of the country had severe impacts as well. But it looked like the central and western parts of the country were probably the areas that were the most vulnerable to like those 20 to 40 inch totals. As far as the impacts to Jamaica, Chris showed those, the one path that went right across the island is Gilbert in 1988, which was before this storm, pretty much the benchmark hurricane for Jamaica. It caused 45 deaths and billions of dollars in damage to the nation. But you can see it moved east to west, and pretty much the entire island suffered from being in the on the right side of the eye, which means it was most of the island was in the really intense damage. Now, Gilbert was not as strong of a hurricane. It was only a category 4 when it passed across Jamaica. But it's very likely that the damage that occurred with Melissa today on Jamaica is significantly worse than what occurred in Gilbert, given how much more intense the storm was. But it's probably a little more regionalized. It's probably more focused around the eye, and certainly the storm surge was almost certainly worse with this event, because Jamaica is actually, even though storms have never, this is an unusual storm. I know a friend of mine who's a former director of the National Hurricane Center shared a graphic with me last night that showed there was in the late 1700s a hurricane that came up on this track that produced hundreds of fatalities. So it's not unprecedented, but it's pretty close. And that south coast of Jamaica is particularly vulnerable to storm surge, and particularly, unfortunately, the area where it made landfall is probably from what I understand, is probably the most vulnerable part of the island to storm surge. So there was probably a really massive storm surge right near where the center came in.
We've touched on it a little bit already, Alan, but let's turn to tomorrow. And as I alluded to in the opening, the day after tomorrow, what do you think the news is going to be as daylight breaks and people start to figure out what really happened, especially in an area of maybe spotty reporting or spotty observations? What's your best guess what we'll hear tomorrow?
Based on previous experience with these kind of events, my guess is that the initial reports will tend to indicate that it wasn't as bad as people might have thought, because most of the initial reports are probably going to come out of Kingston, which is by far the largest city in Jamaica, and which was not near the core of the hurricane. Kingston is on the southeast coast of Jamaica, and while they certainly, I'm sure, experienced flooding and high-end tropical storm or even Category 1 hurricane intensity winds, I haven't seen the actual observations. I'm sure they've experienced that before. The area where the core of the hurricane went through, for the most part, is much more rural, from what I understand. Although there are resorts, and especially on the south coast, Montego Bay appears to have gotten into the eye wall, which means that area probably suffered some pretty severe damage. But the worst of the damage is probably from areas that are going to take a long time to really get to and gauge the magnitude of the damage.
It's funny, Alan, we just realized this yesterday, similar paths going from meteorology into disaster and emergency management. When you look at storms like Melissa and hitting an area that's a developing nation, for example, if you look at the carbon footprint of the nation of Jamaica, out of 210 nations that keep up with carbon emissions, and they rank 128th per capita on emissions, right? So they contribute the least, but yet they're hit the hardest by these disasters. So I want to ask Alan, what does the recovery look like in a place like this? Unfortunately, even though Puerto Rico is part of the United States, how we handled Maria was truly disgraceful. But what does this recovery look like in the wake of Melissa? Nope. Alan, I don't know if you
I cut out for a second. Sorry.
Okay, but so just asking what the recovery looks like.
I'm trying to close, see if I can help with the load on the internet.
Yeah, no worries.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. What does the recovery look like for Jamaica?
Yes, you asked about the recovery, right, Chris?
Yeah, long-term recovery. What does this look like?
Well, I mean, you think about like the long-term recovery for a place, like the Central Gulf Coast that was impacted by Katrina, and I mean, you're talking about a multi-decadal effort. I was actually just on the Mississippi Gulf Coast last week, and it's recovered remarkably in the 20 years since Katrina made landfall, but it's taken 20 years. And my guess is that what we're going to see in Jamaica, in the areas that were hardest hit, is you're going to be looking at that kind of, multi-year to decades type of recovery. And it's going to require a lot of international support. That you alluded to the fact that Jamaica is more of a developing nation. They've never had a disaster of this magnitude strike the nation, and it's one of these all hands on deck situations that hopefully the international community will step up to and help respond to.
I understand you're going to be doing some writing and writing an opinion for the New York Times, and
Yes.
You're retired, so you can speak your mind. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the impact of climate disruption and the warming ocean environment that we're looking at right now, and how it's impacting these hurricane situations that we're facing now.
Yeah, one of the things that is really unique about, well, let me take a step back. There is no doubt that climate change is contributing to significantly warmer oceans globally. We've seen intense maritime heat waves in multiple parts of the planet in the last year, particularly in the last several months over the Northern Pacific. And obviously that hurricanes, tropical cyclones feed, they need that warm oceanic water to fuel their development. So the warmer the water is, at least on a theoretical level, the more intense storm you can have. When you look at Melissa specifically, what's really interesting to me about it is the water south of Jamaica was definitely abnormally warm, like 2 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. But what some of my colleagues have pointed out that's really, to me, almost it's unique in this situation is that the depth of that warm water is really unusually deep. It goes to a great depth, and these intense hurricanes tend to churn up colder water through upwelling process, where the colder water comes up to the surface, and also rainfall tends to cool the water, and you get the mixing, and that in and of itself kind of acts as a brake for the intensity of these stronger hurricanes, particularly when they're slow moving, like Melissa was. But in this case, there was no colder water to upwell because the abnormally warm water extended so deep. So that probably was a factor in enabling the hurricane to continue to intensify all the way up to landfall, whereas even though it was very slow moving, or ordinarily a slow moving hurricane like this would have started upwelling, and that would have at least put a brake on it to some level.
Well, Alan, you've now officially ruined my night with this story about the depth of the temperature, because that is making the hair just stand up on the back of my neck, because it portends such trouble for the future. Let me switch to something that my world does touch on, and that's the world of insurance. And the reports are that maybe only 20% of the structures in Jamaica are covered by some form of insurance. And all of the articles have been that, so much of their insurance is coming from reinsurance companies around the world, making an insurance investment in Jamaica, and then they are backing away for multiple reasons, but climate being a big driver. So with both you and Chris, I'll pose it to both of you. Let's say a reinsurance company like Swiss Re comes to you tomorrow and says, well, it's going to take a massive effort to rehabilitate and to recover from this storm. What is our chances of protecting our investment if we make that insurance decision in Jamaica? You go first, Alan.
I figured as the guest, I got to go first.
Yes,
well, I have not a lot, but I have a little bit of experience in working with some of these reinsurance companies. And I know that they look at this from a very probabilistic standpoint. And, obviously, Chris and I have talked about the unique aspects of this hurricane. And, even though the climate is changing, I would be the first one to say that, that only contributes some level of influence on each particular event. And, it's still relatively unlikely that you're going to see a repeat Category 5 come up from the south and hit Jamaica anytime soon. I mean, there's a reason why it hasn't happened for 250 years. But having said that, you keep loading the dice and you're influencing those probabilities. And so I don't know enough about the reinsurance industry to know at what level it becomes a bad investment. What I do know is we're loading the dice to make these probabilities what might have been a 0.1% chance of a hurricane like this hitting Jamaica, every year, maybe is now a 0.5 in 1% chance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 5 times more likely than it was 50 years ago. And obviously I'm hand waving those numbers. I have no idea what they actually are, but reinsurance companies are trying to figure those numbers out, because that's as Chris and I both know, that's why a lot of the young people that are going through school today, like we did in our youth, are going into reinsurance, because these are the questions that are going to determine, economically what we as a society can afford going forward.
I can't answer or add any more than that. So I want to ask you one last time. And like you're more vocal now that you're retired. Since I'm out of TV, I can say things that I couldn't in TV. So with this Trump administration, final thoughts. How fucked are we as a science, NOAA, NASA, all the research agencies, your former, National Severe Storms Laboratory? What does this look like, and can we survive 4 years?
Okay, well, I'll try to summarize, because I know we're probably running a little out of time, but I'll try to summarize this way. The Trump administration, I was pretty confident once we knew there was going to be a second Trump administration that it was going to be a shit show for science, for lack of a better phrase. But what has really disappointed me, to be honest, is the just complete abdication of the legislative branch. The legislative branch has been a bipartisan supporter of science for my entire career, and the fact that they're not there may be some verbal, oh yeah, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but there's not been much in the way of any concrete pushback. And if we don't get any of that concrete pushback in the next 18 months, we're going to be pretty screwed.
And it's shocking how many people are just willing to just bow down and give him what he wants. And we're in really dangerous, uncharted territory. So, Alan, thank you so much. I knew you were held captive before your travel plans tomorrow. So I can't wait to read the New York Times. Thank you for joining us. For Channing Dutton, David Thorson, I'm Chris Gloninger. Thanks for watching the 3 Degrees podcast. Until next time, stay safe and be sure to find us on Spotify, on YouTube, and the Iowa Writers Collaborative on Substack. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks,